All right, so for everybody who's going to be tuning in, I am here with John Linton. He's well known for his activist work with I Have a Name Project and Let's Be Better Humans. Both of those projects work with homeless people, and he's done a lot of amazing work to help those people who, are stuck out there, especially here in Phoenix in very hot weather, without a lot of resources.
Yeah.
But I'm here to talk to you more about your recent photography journey, and I wanted to kind of start with learning more about how you kind of segued into the work you're doing into more focusing on photography and what that's meant for you.
Well, it's been an interesting transition and quite frankly very unexpected. I'm not too full of pride to mention to the audience that in most cases I would refer to myself as an accidental photographer. This wasn't a plan. It was something that organically was an outflow from the work that I was doing on the street, the photographs that I had been taking for years with the I Have a Name project and those exhibitions that followed. That work on the street, the photography, and of course the outreaches, they're painful. The photography is painful to take. It's not pleasant to look at, nor is it intended to be pleasant. It's actually an effort to evoke emotion and encourage people to look at the individuals that I've photographed as people rather than windows or obstructions to look past or through. The photographs, those photographs and that work is really hard from a soulful place, emotionally. And I began taking photographs in quiet places where I could find sanctuary and really restoration from the work that I was doing on the street. Sarah, I didn't intend really for anyone to see that work necessarily. And I think this kind of moves into perhaps the second question that you had. I'm not sure, but as I followed your outline, but if it were not for, I'd been in the publishing business for a long time. I published an art magazine for years. So I'd been immersed in the art world for a very long time. And through the recession of 2008 and 2009, the life work that I was doing was a casualty of the economic crisis that we went through. Part of the publishing component that stayed intact was publishing that I was doing for individual artists, books. Let me see, books like this book right here. So this is a book that I did for a photographer. This is probably not the best way to show this, but this is a book that I did for a photographer in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Actually, I just spoke to him today, Petite Victory. That's his name. But I was on a trip to Santa Fe, New Mexico to meet with a celebrated photographer in Santa Fe that had shot for Rolling Stone for a bunch of years and then ended up becoming and has been very important to the photographic world in landscape photography. And he was having a group show with two other photographers, and I had a chance interaction with one of those men, and that photographer being Ray Belcher. And Ray Belcher did for, I think it's safe to say, the Galisteo Basin, which is just outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. Ray Belcher did for the Galisteo Basin what Ansel Adams did for Yosemite. Sometimes when artists and photographers, when their work moves in a direction that Ray's had in terms of being celebrated and well received, those artists sometimes they're, and at least in my view, they've been kind of hard. They're almost like rock stars, and they're hard to approach, or at least I've felt that they were hard to approach. And Ray was anything but hard to approach. I was able to look through the body of work that he was showing that day in the show at that exhibition. And then I simply walked up to the man and thanked him for his work. And he said, "You don't have to leave. Let me show you. I'll walk you through the work." And he spent quite a bit of time with me that afternoon. And time is our most valuable resource. I was humbled by it. And I couldn't believe that what transpired. I found myself talking to him. I said, I kind of fuss around with a camera. I have a modest body of work that's traveled a little bit. Street photography. I explained a little bit about the I Have a Name project. And I said, and he said, "But you have other pictures that you want to show me?" And I said, "Yeah." So I presented a few pictures to him that I'd taken. They were pictures that were imported from my camera to my phone, so I was able to show him more than a few photographs. And there was a photograph that he stopped on, and he said, "Okay, a few things. Don't refer to yourself as somebody who fusses around with a camera. You're a photographer. And secondly, if you go back to Phoenix and print this photograph and bring it back to Santa Fe, New Mexico, you can take anything in my studio home." He said, "This photograph is magic." And it was a photograph that I'd taken of some wild horses, some wild Mustangs in Monument Valley. And he said, "You could go, a lifetime without making another photograph like this again." And it's tough to get photographs like the one that I had presented to him. I could grant him that. But I was just blown away that he'd made that gesture. And then lastly, he said, "Start showing your work." So I had done a book for Celebration of Fine Art, which is an art happening in Scottsdale that is this past year. It was their 30th anniversary. And I had done a book for the owner of that art happening on their 25th anniversary. I'd known Susan, the proprietor, for many years through my relationship with the art magazine that I published. And she was aware of the work that I was doing on the street because it had become well publicized here in Phoenix via either art shows or interviews with the newspaper or the news media. So she was aware of that work. But I had sent her then a number, I think 10 photographs that I'd taken, landscape photographs. And she said she had no idea that I was doing that work. I said, "Well, no one has." And I said, "I'd like to apply for your show." And most of the time when an artist gets into the show that she has, there's 100 artists, working artists. It's almost a 3-month-long show. And most of the artists that get into that show, they stay until either they no longer want to stay or until Susan decides that she needs different work that's there. Maybe it's just not a successful marriage for both parties. But either way, most of the people that are there, as long as they're selling, they stay. And I'd mentioned to her that I didn't want any favors because of her relationship, and she said, "You don't have to worry about that. You won't get any favors. It's juried in." So I guess the short story long is that I applied for the show. I think, a couple months later, a letter came in the mail, and frankly, I thought it was a rejection letter. I felt like she would probably, because of the relationship that we had, most likely would have called me rather than sent a letter, and I didn't open that letter for probably a week. And I was more than excited then to have, after opening it, learned that I was juried in this show, and last year represented the third year that I've been showing that landscape work then. And I'm excited and grateful and humbled to be in that place, in that space. So, yeah.
Wow, yeah, it's really great to hear your story of how you got into it more, and it's awesome that you had kind of a mentor. I think it's very important for people, anybody that's, you know, working in photography, to hear, you know, you don't have to be calling yourself an amateur. You don't have to be, you know, be proud of your work, especially if you're doing good work, you know, be proud of that and own that. So that's awesome. I do know that you recently went on a photography journey, or a journey in your Jeep, and traveled around living out of your Jeep, and you were doing some photography on this journey. And I want to hear more about what, you know, the goal of that was, what you felt you accomplished with it, what you experienced with it. I think it'd be really cool to hear more about that story.
Yeah, I'll address that. I wanted to just touch base on that mentorship that you had mentioned, and I think it's important to pay, you know, tribute to Ray, and also mention the way that, you know, this man he left San Francisco in 1968 on a grant to go take photographs in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he never left. I had the occasion to spend a lot of time with Ray, and frankly, he changed the way that I make photography, especially in the digital age. I'd worked with a film camera for a while, and made the jump to a Sony digital mirrorless camera after having a show in Los Angeles a number of years ago with the street photography. The gallerist that I was working with there, he is a very well thought of photographer in Los Angeles, and he had said, for your street work, you really need to be using, you know, this camera. And I wasn't really excited about having to make the jump to learn the technology that would allow you to, I guess, effectively work in what we would call a digital darkroom today. But I was glad that I did make, you know, the transition. It provides, you know, there are certain things that you miss about film, but there are a lot of things that today's technology provides that makes the work, I don't want to say easier, but more convenient. But Mr. Belcher, I remember on one occasion I'd asked him, you know, if you could go anywhere, where would you like to go take photographs? And he said, well, two places, Shiprock and Monument Valley. I haven't been there for a number of years, and those two locations are magic to me. And he said, but I don't drive. And he's an elderly man. His health isn't really that good these days, and hasn't been for a number of years. And I said, well, it's a good thing that I do drive. So I went to Santa Fe, picked him up, and he doesn't own a smartphone. I didn't have really the interest in expressing to him that I could just put Shiprock, New Mexico into my phone, and we'd find a way there pretty easy from Santa Fe, more easily. But he gave me direction, and I took it, and he knew a back way in to Shiprock on this occasion that we were working together, and the day that you know, really changed the way that I make photographs. And we got there, and then he had instructed me to walk, you know, an hour towards Shiprock. And he said, and I want you to plant yourself there and stay there until the sun's gone. And when you come back, I'm going to check your camera, and I don't want to see more than 3 or 4 photographs. And that sounds really kind of elementary, but it changed everything. And what he was speaking about was being present. You know, in the digital age, I mean, we can just kind of click away, or you can, that's an option, and then just comb through photographs hoping to find something that looks interesting, or that you can make look interesting. Or, as Mr. Belcher had expressed, or you can sit there and be present and be mindful and be soulful and and wait for the photograph to happen rather than making a photograph happen. So I think that's important to convey. What was the
Yeah, no,
the
thank you
deep experience? So moving into that, yeah, I decided to make a trip based on really the current state of affairs, with the pandemic. All the spring and summer shows that I had hoped to do were canceled. And based on those cancellations, I wanted to make the best use of my time and the opportunity to perhaps, document something that I hope doesn't happen again for a long while. So I'm actually getting ready to go back out on the road, and that'll be the second leg of the trip. And then the third leg of the trip, we're actually through a friend of mine, we are actually going to document the work and perhaps make a film around this, a short documentary. So I'm excited about that. There were a lot of things that I was gathering content from a lot of different places. Street photography. I was hopeful to get more landscape photography, Sarah, but in the absence of being able to go into either national parks or state parks, that became a little bit more challenging. And then of course I'm taking photographs and collecting content around what empty streets look like, and it was all very interesting. I think for a guy that got his start in the photographic world by taking photographs of people that are living on the street and suffering through the social ill of homelessness, I really got to in some ways feel what it was like to be in their shoes, but in a very I'm living out of my Jeep, so I'm not living on the street, but it was hard to find places to eat. I had to, in a lot of cases, I packed my own food that I brought along with me, and it was tough to find simple things to do. Things that we take for granted every day. Where do you go to the bathroom? How do you do that? So there were that part I found to be, kind of an interesting irony based on how I started taking photography. But the trip was really very interesting. I look forward to the second, and then more importantly, the last leg of the trip that'll be coming up, in the next month or two.
Yeah, so what are you planning to do with the content that you get from these trips? Are you hoping to, get them in a show when shows start opening up, or what is the plan for that?
Yeah, the next year's show for Celebration of Fine Art, I'll be using content from the standpoint of landscape photography. I'll be, there's two photographs. It's last year I had the occasion to go to Cuba and did a show based on that, or that perhaps it was 2 years ago. Lost track of time, and you spend a lot of time in places, and you're hopeful to get a big giant body of work. And the reality is that for instance, this first leg of the trip, 3.5 weeks on the road, there were two photographs that I'll use from the standpoint of something that feels commercial or viable from the standpoint of aesthetic and work that people will hang in their homes. The street photography that I take has no commercial significance. You're not going to hang that work in your house, and frankly, it's not something that is for sale to begin with. But on that end of things, yeah, the photography that I'll collect and catalog from that perspective, it'll either be another show, or we're, as I mentioned, we'll be working on a documentary. And we've spent a lot of time. I have a phone call tomorrow, a second call with the team of filmmakers, and I've had several telephone calls to this point that have been, hours long with the producer that's interested in documenting that work. And when I say that work, it's work on the street. So it'll be interesting to see what develops from that. And we're being very mindful that, there will be, and in the coming days, I'll, with more calls to the filmmaker, we'll discuss what the intention of the film will be, or what we expect to get. But frankly, what I know from having done this work for a number of years, the things that are scripted are important, but the magic happens in the things that are unscripted, and that you just have to be hypersensitive to, and have an awareness for. So that's where we're moving as far as some of that work is concerned.
Okay, great. Yeah, we might have to do a part 2 after your documentary to hear more about that. But
Yeah.
we're getting close to running out of time. I wanted to see if you had any specific advice for people wanting to do gallery shows on how do you do that, or any other advice you want to give our listeners before we run out of time today.
As far as the advice on what to do as far as gallery shows are concerned, it used to be, Sarah, that the art world, it was, when I look back at this, I'm looking back at it over 2 decades, and it was specifically 20 years ago. If you were an artist, whether you're a painter or a sculptor, or in this case a photographer, the modality as far as business, a business modality, you would take your work to a gallery and hope to find gallery representation, and by virtue of that, the gallery is going to have group shows or solo shows, one-man shows or one-woman shows, and you'd hope to get 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 galleries across the country that would represent your work, and you'd be off and running. Today, things are a little bit more complex. There's so much more involved. Gallery representation is still important. It's critical for a variety of reasons. It qualifies work. It qualifies the artist. So those things are invaluable. How does one manage that? How do you get gallery representation? With movement and initiative and effort, and all the while being very thick-skinned about these things, because there are dozens of no's, and oftentimes that leaves you then with a sense of, oh gosh, my work isn't very good. It can be a little bit overwhelming at times, and it can overwhelm the senses to the point where sometimes you feel like throwing in the towel. And so my advice would be just to keep going, and you'll find a fit as far as someone who believes in your work, if you believe in your work. And that's just one component at this stage of the game. It's critical as well to have a social media presence, whether it's Facebook or whether it's Instagram, and then as well an online presence with your own website. So it's no longer just gallery representation. It's all of these 3 components together, and there has to be a healthy marriage between the 3 for an artist to become successful. But it happens, and you just you have to persevere and push through some of the obstacles that get in the way, and just keep getting up and moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Where can our listeners follow your, follow your journeys and find your work? Where's the best place?
You can find me, on Facebook at John Linton, and as well on Instagram at uh, um, John Linton Photos, Photos, and then as well on my website, John Linton Photography. Those three places. Yeah.
Okay, great. We'll be sure to post some links to that in the comments here. And that's pretty much it for our time, but thank you so much. It was so awesome getting to hear more about your experiences recently and how you became, you fell in love with photography. So thank you. I appreciate you joining us, and I wish you a very safe journey coming up
Thank you.
here. Excited to hear more about that in the future.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity, Sarah. And we'll speak again soon.